That people still talk about that. However, we know that there was much more to Keith, and we're going to let Dale tell us all about it today. So thank you, Dale, and I'll turn it over to you. Oh, one thing I would like to ask, we all are old and have hearing issues, so I'll leave it up to Dale whether or not he wants to have interjection during the process, but if not, please no chatter among yourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. It's happy to be here. I used to live here. So this morning we're going to talk about my dad, Keith Harris, and his World War II experience, basically. A few little anecdotes beyond that. But normally, when I would give a presentation, I would just do bullet points and kind of wing it. But I really want to be accurate on this one, so I'm going to read, actually. So I apologize for that, but it's better than getting facts wrong, I think. So we'll just go from there.
Dale, do you need more light up there?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Let me try this without the mic. Can you all hear me now? If you can't hear me, let me know. No. Okay. All right. Anyway, here we go. Well, Keith Harris lived from 1919 to 1980. His life was shorter than many, but longer than a lot of his colleagues flying B-17s over Nazi Germany. So he did survive 25 bombing missions, which was the standard in those days. You had to do 25 missions, and if you survived, you got to go home. Yeah. If you didn't, you might spend a couple of years in Stalag 17 or something, or worse. But anyway, so this is the story of his early life and his experiences during the war. Keith grew up on the family farm east of Earlville, about 3 or 4 miles east out there, along the CB&Q tracks in those days. The farm had been in the family since 1872, and it was sold in 1973, so just over 100 years on that farm. When Keith was a child, he and his grandfather were driving back from Elgin back to the farm, and they happened to see an airplane, an old open cockpit biplane, flying off a pasture along the road, which was pretty common in those days. They're barnstormers, they were called. These guys have an airplane and they need to buy gas, so they'd fly around and give rides to the unsuspecting public and introduce them to aircraft. So my great-grandpa, he was known to be pretty careful with his money. But for some reason, he anteed up the money to take this ride for him and his grandson, Keith. So they hopped in this airplane, took off, flew around, and from that moment, Dad was committed to aviation. He just loved airplanes, loved flying, and did it every chance he got. Great-grandpa, unfortunately, his hat blew off and he lost it, so he was not entirely happy about that. So let me catch up a little here. Okay, after graduation from high school in 1937, Dad, and I'm going to try to say Keith, but it's hard not to say Dad. But, well, you know who I'm talking about anyway. So anyway, after high school, this was in the Depression, later in the Depression, things were pretty tight. And he was the second son, so his opportunities were somewhat limited. He did go to work over at the locker plant with George Gould and Janet Worsley. Some of you may remember them. And he worked there for not very long. He went out to Lincoln, Nebraska to take a course on aircraft mechanics. And he finished that course, but there weren't any jobs available, so he came back to the farm. But then, late in 1941, it became obvious that the U.S. was going to get involved in the European War, and the draft was coming back, and he didn't really want to get drafted into the infantry, but he thought he was exempt, and then they changed the rules a little bit, so it included him now. So he was subject to the draft. So he went down to Ottawa and volunteered for the Army Air Corps, as they called it in those days, now the Air Force, and got all signed up. When he first joined, they sent him down to Rantoul, Illinois at, I forget the name of the base, but Chanute Field at Rantoul. But he didn't have much to do down there. It was late in the year, and everybody was living in tents, all the soldiers, because they're just growing so fast, so many new soldiers. But these tents all had an oil heater on them, and frequently the tent would catch on fire, and that would be exciting. So his basic job there was to help out the firemen at the firehouse, but he really didn't have much to do. But he signed up to get trained to be a link trainer instructor. Anybody know what a link trainer is? I see a couple of hands up. It's a very small flight simulator, basically full motion. The pilot sits inside. They close a hood over the top so he can't see out, and then the machine moves around and teaches him instrument flying. So it's pretty primitive, but that's what they had in those days. So Dad learned how to be an instructor in that. So he finished that course, and they sent him to New York City. Why? You never know. It's the Army. So he was at a base in Brooklyn, New York, which was actually kind of good for him. He had a fair amount of free time. He'd never been to New York before. He'd probably never been any place other than Chicago for a big city. But so in New York, he had free times occasionally. Mainly, he said they were doing police work, and not police work, I mean picking up trash. That's police work in the military. That's right. So it wasn't much fun, and he said the sergeants there didn't really like the Air Corps guys. He thought they were kind of sissies for not wanting to get down in the mud and fight that way. But anyway, so on one day, Dad was making $17 a month, so they took out laundry, another $3, but so he's got his $14 a month. But in New York in those days, the subway cost a nickel. So one day he went up into Manhattan. I think he was in Manhattan. Anyway, he got on the subway. He said he rode all day long, because you're in the subway, as long as you don't come out, you can get on a different train and just keep riding all day. And he said it was a great tour of New York City. So he enjoyed that. He also went to the Radio City Music Hall and saw the famous Rockettes, and a couple of other famous entertainers. So he didn't mind that so much. But then, eventually, they assigned him to Elmendorf Field in Alaska Territory in those days. So, of course, nobody had passenger airplanes to worry about, so they put him on a troop train, and this train went all the way from New York City down around, I think it was the Route 66 path, through Oklahoma and Arizona. And then he ended up in San Francisco. I'm not quite sure what the route was, but he eventually got to San Francisco. They had a movie of him while he was there. But then from San Francisco, they went, I believe, by boat up to Seattle. And he was there for a little while. Actually, that's where this picture was taken. But in Seattle, up to Elmendorf, took a boat up through the Inside Passage of Alaska. Everybody ever done the Inside Passage? It's a beautiful ride. See, a couple have. But this is 1941, early 41, so things were a little more primitive in those days. he said that he got to Alaska and they came up out of this canyon and he looked over and there was a guy driving a Fordson tractor plowing a field. And he said, "You don't plow fields in Alaska." He said, that's what he saw. So, catching up a little bit here. What's the next slide there? Okay, that's a little farther along in the talk. No, you're good. PJ, this is my wife, PJ. This is the first time we've done this sort of a thing. So give us both a little latitude, please. Okay, he was in Alaska. They had a few operational airplanes up there, not very many, but there were some. But Dad was training on a Link trainer, and at one point they had an earthquake. And Dad had never experienced an earthquake before. Probably most people around here haven't. But he said it really shook, and there was a guy inside the Link trainer. Popped the hood open. "Who's shaking this thing?" But anyway, they on December 7th, 1941, some of you may have heard something happened that day. Well, they heard about the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor, and they kind of figured they were next because, you know, Alaska curves over toward Japan, and they were a little worried about being attacked. So Dad was assigned to guard duty. He said he had to walk around the base with a rifle and didn't really know what he was doing, but he had to do it. But then things calmed down and he went back to his normal duties. But because of that, the Army was really staffing up for air crews and pilots. And Dad really wanted to be a pilot. So he applied for the pilot program in the Army. First they turned him down. They said his eyes weren't quite good enough, which he didn't like at all. So he said he ate a bunch of carrots and everything. I don't think the carrots did it, but I think maybe they lowered the standards a little bit. So he did get selected to go to flight training. So from there, he went down to Southern California, Cal Aero Academy, and that's where he learned to fly. Took his basic training. Can you see if that video will play now, PJ? Maybe. You flunked. Oop, that ain't it. We were doing this yesterday when we were setting up, and sometimes it would work and sometimes it wouldn't. I can't read that word, can you?
It says done.
Oh. Well, rats. No, I'm pretty sure I'm the first.
No problem.
So I'll describe what you're not going to see. There was a bunch of biplanes, Stearman PT-17 biplanes. Is what he learned to fly in. So he's got some video of the airplanes flying around and landing. So that was his introduction to flight training. He said while he was there, some of the pilots weren't flying and they were watching the other planes in the pattern. And he looked over there and he saw a plane just dive right into the ground. So there was the sergeant next to him, and he said, "Hey, Sarge, I think that we lost one." And the sergeant, no, they're all there. Don't worry about it. But he wasn't satisfied. So he ran down to the end of the runway. There was a little pond there. And there was the tail of an airplane sticking up from the water. But the pilot, fortunately, had gotten out. He was kind of sitting on the top of it, coughing up blood or mud and water and nasty stuff. But Dad waited out there and got him off the plane and got him to shore and got him sent off for medical attention. But that was memorable for him. He talked about that more than once. Of course, a lot of these stories he talked about more than once. Which is good for me because my memory is not that great. On his first flight, the instructor he had, the flight instructor, he said he was an old farmer from around the neighborhood somewhere. So, nothing against old farmers. But he was not a military flight instructor, but he was just doing the primary instructor. So Dad said on his very first flight in this open cockpit biplane, the instructor said, check your seat belt, make sure it's tight. So he did, and he said, I'm okay. And then the instructor turned the plane upside down and told him to hold his arms outside the cockpit to prove he wasn't hanging on, that he trusted his equipment. So, so that was kind of a test, I guess. Okay, well, from the PT-17, he worked his way up to more complex airplanes, multi-engine, and finally he was assigned to the B-17 bombers. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. She's learning. Now this particular picture, the bomb group that Dad was assigned to was the 390th, and they had the square J on the tail. That's how they told each other apart. And the name of the painting is No Flying Today, obviously, because it looks like a little snow on there. But it is just a painting. But somebody ran across that and gave this painting to me, or it's a print, actually. But what a happy coincidence to get the right group and everything with the right airplane. They did, Dale's interested in old airplanes, so here's one. So that worked out really nice. But just to talk about the B-17 a little bit. It's 4 engines, retractable landing gear. This is the chin turret. Now, Dad's airplane did not have this chin turret. That was a later model. There were 2 machine guns in there. Then there's a top turret with 2 machine guns. And let me tell you a little bit about this, because this would rotate all the way around, and you go up and down and shoot bad guys. But the bad guys pretty soon figured out, before they added this feature to the B-17, the bad guys figured out that if you come straight at the B-17, none of the guns will hit you. There's kind of a dead spot right in front. So that's what they capitalized on, of course. So that's when they added this. But before that, they were on a mission, and Dad said there was an enemy fighter coming straight at them. And the guy in the top turret laid those 50s right over the cockpit and fired at this fighter. And he said, boy, was that loud. But on the good side, they destroyed the fighter, so a happy ending for our side anyway. Okay, so the crew of 10. Back here, this is the belly turret, which would go down and around and shoot all different directions. And the waist gunners would stand right here as an open window. And when they're at altitude for a bombing mission, it's frequently 50 to 60 degrees below zero. And they're standing there in an open window, trying to shoot bad guys. So kudos to those guys for doing it. And then the tail gunner back here, he had 2 50 calibers also. So a crew of 10, 4 officers, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier were officers. The rest were enlisted. So the waist gunners, the top turret gunner, the radio man, they were all enlisted. But in those days, they didn't go too much by rank. They were just a crew, you know. That's what I'm told anyway. None of this hardcore military stuff. Right. They just wanted to get through their 25 and go home. going through my notes a little bit. Wingspan of 103 feet, weighed 6,135 pounds, and had a maximum gross of 65,000 pounds. So it was a big airplane, especially in those days. When the B-17 came out, now maybe Boeing just said this, but it may be true. They said with the 4 engines and the performance this thing had, it could outperform any other airplane in the sky, including fighters. So it could outrun and outclimb. I mean, that ended after a while, but in those days, they were pretty proud of the B-17. Now, the very first flight of a B-17, made by Boeing in Seattle, they wheeled it out, all the dignitaries were there, they take this flight, and boom, crashed. They think he had forgotten to unlock the control locks. On an airplane, when you're on the ground and parked, you lock the controls so the wind doesn't flop them around. They think he forgot to unlock them, so he couldn't maneuver. So, but that didn't stop the deal. They kept going. Okay, so they did quite a bit of training. I'm actually kind of surprised on how much training they did. But, I mean, it was good that they did, but they really wanted pilots over in Europe to win the war. But let's try the next slide. Okay. This is a very famous picture. It was taken outside of Dad's airplane by one of the waist gunners, who was a big amateur photographer. So this is Dad's plane. That's the tail right there, and this is the other planes in the formation. I don't know what people know about formation flying, but in those days, they liked to keep the whole group really close together because that's much better protection from fighter attacks. You don't want the fighters to get inside your formation. You want to keep them as far away as possible. So they really stressed a tight formation, and it's really tight. Of course, there were a lot of mid-air collisions too, but that's the price you pay, I guess, for a tight formation. But this particular picture, Stan Smith was his name. These contrails are from P-47 fighters. And in this case, they haven't even left England yet. They're just forming up over England, getting ready to head over the channel. But because the fighters were so much faster than the bombers, they had to kind of fart around and stay out of the way until things got ready to go. So it made a really pretty picture, I thought. It's usually called top cover, and I'm told it's one of the most famous pictures from the 8th Air Force in that time. Okay, there's another video that may or may not work. There, okay. I'm sorry for the quality, but Dad took this out the pilot's window. And this is from the co-pilot's perspective. But they're doing formation flying training. It was over in northern Montana. So I thought it's pretty interesting how close they get on these formations. I know there are a pilot or two in the room and probably has not flown that tight a formation. So you see this plane, he's pretty close. But then here's another one. It's even closer. It looks like they're right on top of it. But that's what they did. And the 390th really prided themselves on tight formations. Don't know exactly why, except they survived. So that's the end of that. Just hit return again. Okay. That's Dad right there. Everybody's got big smiles on. And the reason is, well, I'll tell you the whole story. They took off on a mission. The mission was scrubbed. So they had to return to base, which happened quite a bit. But as they were coming into the field, they couldn't get the landing gear down. And they tried and tried and tried everything they could think of. But it just wouldn't come down. Now, they knew they'd have to do a belly landing with no landing gear. Now, you may remember the landing gear that sticks down the two big wheels right below the cockpit. The trouble with belly landings in a B-17 is that ball turret that hung down from the belly. When they would hit the ground, frequently the airplane would break in two and crash and everybody would die in a big fire, which is kind of what they expected to happen this day. But fortunately, they flew out over the North Sea and they found a few tools on board, and they were able to get the ball turret unmounted and dropped it into the sea. So then they didn't have to worry about the ball turret. But the commander, the colonel on the base, as they were flying around trying to figure out what to do, I'm not quite sure what his reasoning was, but he called Dad on the radio and said, "Hey, do you want to loop it?" Which means do a loop in the airplane, in a B-17, which technically can be done. But I'm speculating that the colonel said, "Hey, they're all going to die anyway. Let's see what happens." So Dad called back to the crew on the intercoms, "Hey, you want to loop it?" And they all said, "No." So they didn't do that. And then they said, "Well, you want to bail out over the field, parachute down instead of risking the crash landing?" And they all said no to that too. So it all came down together. And Dad said they made a nice landing. He landed on the grass beside the main runway so he wouldn't foul the runway. And thought it might be a little softer too, I think. But he said after they touched down, they rolled for about 2 miles because what he had forgotten, the wheels on the B-17 stick out the bottom just a few inches. So he was just rolling along. I said, "Dad, why didn't you put on the brakes?" I never thought of it. Had other things on his mind. So the props were bent and there was some sheet metal damage and stuff, but they did repair the airplane and put it back in service. He said it was never quite the same after that. But maybe he wasn't either. So, 25 missions. That was the standard in those days. And the statisticians in the Army had figured all this out. I guess they didn't have anything better to do. But Dad said after they got to England, they were in this big briefing for the crews that had come in. And the officer that was briefing them said, "Look to your left and look at the guy on your left. Now look at the guy on your right. Only one of the three of you is going to make it." So that was pretty sobering. And those were the stats. About a third of the bomber crews made their 25 missions. And then after more of them made it, they raised it to 35 missions. But Dad didn't have to do that. So after he flew his missions, and well, I'll get to that in the proper order, I guess. On the bombing runs, depending on how far they went into Europe, which almost every time, the P-47s, you saw the fighter contrails, well, they didn't have enough fuel to go all the way to the target and back. So they'd escort the bombers as far as they could, and then they'd turn around and go home and get more fuel. But in the meantime, the bombers are going on to the target unprotected. So there were an awful lot of losses, and hence that 1/3 surviving rate. But later on in the war, the P-51s and P-38s were able to fly farther, so it gave them more protection. But during Dad's mission, which was from August 43 to December 43, right around Christmas he finished, that was still pretty hard times. Later on, somebody calculated that the least survivable job in the military in World War II, the very worst was a German submarine crew. But the second worst was an air crew in the 8th Air Force. So odds were not good. They were all volunteers, by the way. I don't know if everybody knows that. Everybody on the air crew was a volunteer. But then again, the alternative is infantry, so might have been a good incentive. We're doing okay? Getting a little short on time. This document I'm leafing through is going to be available to the Historical Society, so if anybody wants to look at it in the future. Also, Dad made some audio recordings before he died, obviously, and the museum has a copy of those available, and also it's available online. And he talks about some of the missions in his life in the military. I listen to it every once in a while just to hear his voice again.
It's on YouTube?
Not yet. I'll talk to Alan. Alan has the site. I should get him to put it up on YouTube, but it's his site, so I can't twist his arm too high. Alan is my oldest brother, in case you didn't know. Okay. Oh, here's another incident. They were taking off on a mission, or getting ready to take off. They taxied out from their hard stand. And Dad thought the tail wheel felt kind of mushy, like maybe the tire was low. So they got to the end of the runway preparing to take off, and he asked the crew, hey, somebody jump out and check that tire. So one of the guys did. And the guy said, yeah, it's fine. So hearing that, Dad said, okay, we're going. He pushed the throttles forward. What he didn't know was that guy who was checking the tire wasn't in the airplane yet. So this guy, he ran. The waist door on a B-17 is toward the back between the wing and the tail. It's just a little door, but the door swings out this way into the wind, of course, which is what you'd want. But so this guy ran up and he tried to jump in. He couldn't quite make it. One of the other crew members, grabbed him by his parachute straps. But then this door is coming back, trying to crush him. So in the meantime, they're rolling down the runway, and eventually they take off, and the guy's still hanging there by his parachute straps. But they finally pulled him in, and everything went okay. Dad was not happy at all about that. Why didn't somebody tell me? But the guy who was holding the straps, he wrote an article that was published in a magazine later on describing the incident. So just a little excitement in there. I'm sorry?
He had his hands busy.
Yeah. Now in his group, the 390th, there was another pilot named Geary was his name. Kind of a character, I'm told. But Geary was really frustrated. As a pilot, you don't get to shoot any guns. And he said, I really want to shoot at the Nazis. So somehow, regulations were a little looser in those days. He got a hold of a Tommy gun, which is a shoulder-fired .45 caliber, fully automatic gun. So Gary's got this Tommy gun with him in the cockpit, and he sees a fighter out there, and he sticks the barrel out the window. He starts firing. And the rest of the crew said, knock it off. You're going to shoot a propeller or a fuel tank or something. So that was just a one-time deal. But I have to admire his interest in combating the enemy.
Yeah.
But not the best choice. Okay, 17th of August, 1943. This is only their third mission. But it's an unusual mission in that there are two components, two big groups. One of them went to Schweinfurt, and if you ever studied your World War II history, you might know the Schweinfurt mission was a disaster. It lost an awful lot of airplanes and crew members. Now, the other part of that was to go to, the name it just escaped my mind. Anyway, a different town. So they went and dropped their bombs on that target, but the plan was, well, let me back up just a little bit, because it took a long time. When the airplanes would take off from the field, they would all climb to an altitude, and then they'd try to find each other and form up into formations. That was really a dangerous thing to do, especially when it was cloudy, because the airplanes would come up through the clouds. Oh, well, these other airplanes. So a lot of mid-air collisions and a lot of fatalities doing that, but that's the best they thought they could do. So anyway, on this mission, it was a foggy day. Now, Dad's group, they had trained on, I wouldn't call it blinds, but takeoffs where they couldn't see. So they just have to go by the compass. Which I personally, well, I used to fly, but I never tried that because it seems dangerous to me. But anyway, they practiced this, and they got pretty good at these takeoffs in the clouds. Unfortunately, another group, the 100th group, that they were going to fly with, they did not develop those skills. So they took a long time to get off the ground that day. In the meantime, Dad's group was up there burning gas, waiting for the other group. But their plan was to fly this mission over Germany, and then from there, fly over the Alps to North Africa and land in North Africa. They call it a shuttle mission. I don't know if they ever did it again, because I'm not sure it was all that successful. But they dropped their bombs okay, but unfortunately, as they're going across the Mediterranean, quite a few of them ran out of gas, had to ditch in the sea. Dad was a little more fortunate that they couldn't make it to the base they were supposed to go to, but he saw a dry lake bed down there in North Africa somewhere, and he landed on that dry lake bed. He was just about out of gas. I think they said they had 10 minutes of fuel left. So he was fortunate on that. Now, after they landed, some of the natives came by and said, hey, there's another crashed American airplane over here in the jungle over here. So well, we better go check it out. So some of the crew hiked over there through the jungle. And all they found was the wreck and bodies. They didn't find any survivors. But Dad said, anything that wasn't nailed down disappeared. That's just a different culture, you know. But eventually they dropped some fuel to them, and they were able to fly to the base. And then they flew back to England a few days later. While they were there, one of the crews in a different airplane, they adopted a donkey for some reason. I guess donkeys in North Africa are available. But they adopted this donkey, and they decided to take it back to England with them as a pet. So they loaded up in the belly of the B-17, and they rigged up an oxygen mask for us. And they got it to England. I don't know what happened to it after that. There's if you're interested in further research, the 390th has a big museum in Tucson area, and there's videotapes and all sorts of information if you want to know more about it. But that little incident about the donkey, that came from a DVD that they put out. One of the crew members talked about that. But moving forward, the 100th group. The 100th Bomb Group, there was part of the same wing as the 390th, so they frequently flew together. But the 100th had developed a really bad reputation for getting shot down. Now, one crew member from the 390th said, well, that's because they didn't keep a tight formation. They were flying all over the sky. Now, other people repeated a story that may or may not be entirely true, but it's an interesting story. In those days, when an airplane, a bomber, was disabled and couldn't proceed further, they would put down their landing gear to signal to the Germans that, hey, I give up, I'm going to surrender. So this airplane from the 100th did that, and they started down toward landing. But as they got closer to the ground, some of the gunners on that B-17 started shooting at the fighters that were escorting them, which was considered rude. So some people say that after that, whenever the Germans saw a 100th Group bomber, that was their first target, because they were upset about that. Again, that may or may not be entirely true, but it's a common story. I've heard it multiple times. Okay. Blind takeoffs. Munster. October 10th, 43. They were sent on a mission to Munster, Germany. They went to the briefing in the morning, and in the briefing they'd pull back the shade and show their targets and the route and everything. But when they showed the target for the aiming point in Munster, it was the front steps of a church right downtown Munster. And Dad and his crew both thought, why are we bombing a church on a Sunday morning? Is that really militarily appropriate? But so he talked to the boss, the colonel, and the colonel said, that's the target, go. And then they saw Dad's airplane, instead of flying with a 390th, which was normal, they had him flying with a 100th, which was not normal. And the crew were unhappy about that. Said, we'd rather stick with the people that stay in the air more than the people that crash. But the colonel said, no, they need you. And I was thinking, well, of course they need him because they've lost so many other airplanes. But, you know, so that was the military. Off we go. So they took off, and they're heading for Munster. And they get fairly close, and the fighters just swarmed up. He said he'd never seen so many fighters coming after him. And they went after the 100th first. Of course, they're all in formation. The lead airplane of the 100th, Dad thinks probably the pilots were shot because the airplane just started gradually descending and slowing down. Now, if you've ever flown formation, if you've ever driven next to somebody, if they start slowing down, you got to coordinate. It's a little tricky. Well, it's this whole formation of airplanes kind of stacking up on each other, trying to stay together. But it really didn't matter all that much because they were all shot down immediately anyway, except Dad and one other airplane. So out of 13 in the formation, 11 of them were gone. So they went on, bombed Munster, went back home. He said when they got home, the weather was really bad. They couldn't land at their normal base at Framlingham. He said the airplane was so shot up, I think he had at least one, if not two, engines out. So he said it would never take off again, but he did manage to get it to an alternate base and land there. Well, the alternate base is the base for the 100th Group. So he and this other guy come in, and the people on the base said, where's everybody else? And they ain't coming. So Dad said that was a pretty sad day at that base. He also said nobody felt much like flying for a few days after that. Hard to imagine, but psychology. Yeah, there's pretty strong psychology to fly in a thing in the first place. Okay, moving on. Oops. The Bloody 100th, that's what their name was, or became to be known as. Okay, here's a related story. Anybody know the Koss family from Pawpaw? Heard of them? One person does. There was a guy named Wesley Koss. How about A.P. Moore? Anybody know him? Okay. Old guys. Anyway, Wes Koss was a B-17 pilot, but he was stationed in Italy with the 15th Air Force. But he flew a mission over France and he got shot down. He parachuted down and survived. But then he was in occupied France and he wanted to get home, of course. So with the help of the French underground and a little bit of luck, he did manage to walk all the way across France, across the Pyrenees Mountains, down into Spain, which was sort of neutral, sort of Nazi. But so he got to Spain, and then the American air attaché got him hooked up to get transport to England. But he got to England, and nobody knew him because he was stationed in Italy. And it wasn't uncommon for the Germans to insert a spy pretending to be a downed airman. So they couldn't trust him right away because nobody in England knew him. But he said he was being driven by the MPs to a place where he's going to be held. And behind him, a guy on a bicycle comes up. They're coming through London. A guy on a bicycle catches up with a truck. And he says, "Hey, Wes, do your parents know you're still alive?" Yeah, that was A.P. Moore from Earlville. So that's kind of a small world deal. So now A.P. also knew that Dad was in England. He'd finished his missions by then. He was ferrying airplanes from Scotland down into the bases in southeastern England. But women would fly the B-17s from the United States to Scotland. But because they were women, were not allowed in the war zone. So regular guys had to go up and pick up the airplanes and fly them back. So Dad did that for 2 or 3 months. He didn't much care for it. It was kind of boring, I think. After combat, I suppose just about anything would be boring. But anyway, they reached out to Dad, and they brought him down to London to vouch for Wes Koss, and so he was accepted as an American and went on from there. It always struck me as it's just a small world. You're a prisoner in London, and some guy in a bicycle, "Hey, Wes." Now, I don't know if this Wes Koss was any relation to Vince Koss, who used to have the store here. Cousin, okay, somebody knows. I know his dad ran a, I'm sorry?
There was a problem there, they didn't speak.
Oh, sorry to hear that. Okay, Papa. Philippines. After Dad finished his missions, they assigned him to learn to fly the B-29. Now the B-29 is a much larger airplane than the B-17. Still 4 engines, but more powerful. It's pressurized, it fly higher and faster, it carry a big load. But it was also more difficult to fly. I've seen videos of people flying it. There's no power steering on that thing. You gotta crank that yoke over. But anyway, they did that. But then while Dad was being trained in the B-29, the atomic bombs were dropped in Japan. And the whole world changed. So the war ended. And then they had to figure out what to do with all these pilots and other GIs that they didn't need so much anymore. So they sent Dad over to the Philippines, Clark Field in the Philippines. He didn't much care for that either. Of course, he didn't get to fly much. He said he got the minimum of flying, but they made him a company commander, and that was in the days of the segregated military, and his company was all black. Now, Dad grew up in Earlville. He didn't have a lot of experience with black people. Not that I heard of any problems, but it was just a cultural shock, I think, to have to deal with that. But I'm not sure if it was a good idea, but he wanted to bring my mother and my oldest brother and my sister over to the Philippines, have the family together. But he had to sign up for family housing. And he said he'd put his name on the list, and he'd gradually go up the list. And then some senior officer would come in and put his name on the list, and he'd go back down the list. After a while of that, he decided, this is not for me. I better get out of the Army. He said they really wanted to get rid of pilots anyway. Dad never had any college, and even then, if you wanted to advance as a military officer, you really needed college. So he had a disadvantage right there for that. Now he did, when he was stationed in El Paso, before he went to the Philippines, they had him fly kind of a bond tour or something up to Cedar Rapids, Alaska. So several of the family from around here drove out to Cedar Rapids to see him in his big fancy airplane. But then the next day the engine wouldn't start. He said it was really cold. Okay, Philippines. Oh, while he was living, I had a picture of his place where he lived in the Philippines. It was a thatched hut. It was not nice at all. And he was an officer. I can't imagine what the enlisted guys lived in. But he'd say he'd lie there at night and the rats would be running across him. Just not a lot of fun. So he decided to come home. So he put in his papers to get out. Got out in the spring of '47. Came home and started farming with his dad and his brother, Bob. I don't know if, maybe you folks, I got some relatives here. Maybe you folks know if Bob had his farm by 1947, 48.
Yeah, he had the home place then,
Okay.
since I was 6.
You don't remember the details?
No.
Because you were 6.
I remember there was a cat that threw up in the house.
Oh, that's more memorable. So anyway, they were farming out east. And they were consolidating the schools in those days. They used to have all these country schools, and I know at least one member of our audience attended one of them, because I have a picture. And but they were closing those schools and bringing the kids into town for school. So they started busing them with school buses. So in 1948, they got that organized, and Dad applied and was selected as one of the bus drivers. So he did that for over 30 years. He had kids riding his bus whose grandparents had ridden his bus. But he just loved that job. Now, he did have a little anecdote he told about driving the bus and the B-17. He said they're very similar. You start out early in the morning. There's a bunch of people behind you who really don't want to go where you're going. So the ambient noise is about the same. And everybody's really happy at the end of the day when you get home. So that's... Okay. Let's hit that again and see if we can get something else to come up. Okay, this is from Stars and Stripes. That was the military paper during the war. And they wrote him on his Billy Landing. They wrote that up on the Stars and Stripes. And they said, came in like Sonia Henney. Now, nobody here knows who Sonia Henney was, but she was a skater. And they said, we don't need those wheels, just grease the bellies and slide them in like that. So he was written up 2 or 3 times in the Stars and Stripes. So in about 1961, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was around 61, he and his brother Bob bought an airplane, a Piper Cub. Let's see our next page here. And this is from a bombing mission. I don't know if you can see the little pock marks here, those where the bombs had hit. That was considered a really, really good mission with good accuracy. And I think they won the Presidential Unit Citation for that, which was pretty rare. So they were pretty proud of that. Next slide. I think this is the Marienburg, no, it's a Schweinfurt mission. See all the smoke and the damage down there. The bomb sight on the B-17, it was the Norden bomb site. It was really famous and very super secret. They had to keep it in a bag when it wasn't in the airplane and guard it and all that. Turned out that was unnecessary because the Germans already knew all about it. But when they were first testing the Norden bomb site, they thought it was so accurate that one of the crew members said, well, what pickle barrel do you want me to drop this bomb into? So they put it in the pickle barrel. It became kind of a famous. They were not that accurate. If they got within a mile, I think they were considered pretty good. But, okay, so they bought the Cub. Stanley Hum. Is he still around, anybody? Yeah. They bought a Cub from Stan. Stan was just starting his aviation career in those days. And so, and we had that Cub for 13, 14 years. Flew a lot, gave a lot of rides. I imagine some people in this audience got rides in that airplane. It was a lot of fun. It was a little small. Let's go to the next slide. I think I might have a picture of it. Oh, this is in North Africa. These are the natives that were helping themselves to pieces and parts. Next slide. And this is on the way to a mission. Now, this is not, I don't think it was one of Dad's missions, but just to demonstrate the formations and the contrails as they're on their way to the target. Later in the war, they'd had up to 1,000 airplanes, 1,000 bombers on these missions. Next slide. And this is the spot remover. That's Dad's airplane. And these black things, that's flak. This is a piece of flak. Pass this around. I do want to make sure I get this back. I'll give it to Roy here. But they would send up explosive charges up to the altitude where the bombers were, and then it would scatter these hunks of metal all through the sky, hoping the bombers would fly into them and wreck. So that's flak. Dad said that came through the top turret plexiglass and rattled around up there and then fell down, so he got it. But I think flak probably brought down almost as many bombers as the fighters did. You can, well, you could see, just fill in the sky with this metal. Okay. There we go. This is the lucky bastard certificate. And this is a list of his missions. But anybody who survived the 25, I've got one of these. And I just want to refer a couple of things. I'm going to leave the link with Chris, I guess. My brother Alan has a website, and on it he has most of the material I showed you, plus quite a bit other material. My mother kept a scrapbook when Dad was overseas, and that's all reproduced on Alan's site. And also 2 audio recordings that Dad made back in the 70s, I guess, where he describes the Munster mission and also his early days in the Air Force. So you're welcome to listen to those. Like I said, I think the museum has a copy available. I'm not quite sure how to arrange it, but it's available. Now, another thing, there's a book called Munster, The Way It Was, written by Ian Hawkins in England. He and Dad corresponded quite a bit as Ian was writing this book. So Dad's quoted quite a bit in the book. So I'm sure it's available somewhere. I haven't looked to buy a copy lately. And the other thing is, as far as more on the general entertainment, people heard of 12 O'Clock High, the movie? Came out in 1947 or 48, I think. Of the guys who were flying those missions, I've heard more than one say that's the most realistic of the movies about flying bombers in World War II. So if you want, it's available on YouTube, no charge. So now there's also the Memphis Belle. There's two versions of the Memphis Belle. There's the original documentary, and then there's a theatrical movie that came out in the 80s, I guess, 80s or early 90s. They're both called the Memphis Belle. Now the original was the last mission of this airplane called the Memphis Belle. It was the first to complete 25 over Europe. So they made a big deal about that. So after they survived, they flew them back to the States and they did a bond tour and all that. But on the theatrical movie, of course, they had to Hollywood it up a little bit. So now I had the opportunity to hear the pilot of the Memphis Belle give a talk once. And he said about the theatrical movie, he said, yeah, probably all that stuff happened at some point in the war. But if that had happened on one mission, I'd be in a loony bin. I took Mom to see that movie in a theater, and I think it shook her up a little bit, and kind of wondered whether I should have done that. But anyway, she knew what he was up against. Oh, and Wes Goss, his book is called Stardust Falling. And again, I'll give this information to Chris to spread around if anybody wants to read it. It's a story about all his escape from Europe and everything. Is there anything else there, or is that the last slide? Oh, that's by the B-29. You see, it's quite a bit larger. This is him. It's quite a bit larger airplane. What else do we have there? Ah, and the Cub. November 3499 November. Fine airplane. Anything beyond that, that's probably the last one. Yeah, okay, that's it. Okay, that's the end of my remarks. Are there any questions?
So what was the quantity and weight of the bombs that they could carry?
Typically 500 pounders.
And how many could they carry?
Generally, they would take, I think, 12 500 pounders. So that'd be, well, whatever that is. But it varied. But 6,000, yeah. You'd think I'd know that. Yes, sir.
The Memphis Belle is over at the Air Force Museum, the largest museum in the world, and it took them, I think, 13 years to restore that. And
Yeah.
it's in super shape. I got pictures of it. I was over there just a few months ago. It's amazing. The Memphis Belle is over at the Air Force Museum, the largest museum in the world. Huh? Where is it? I don't know where it is. Dayton. Dayton. Oh. Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. You can't see it all in one day.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my goodness, they got 4 big huts of just planes hanging from the ceiling all over. It must have been 200 feet high. It's just amazing.
I'll have to check that out. I
It's
could.
318 miles from here.
Oh, okay.
I don't know whether the sandwich is closer or not.
Probably rode his motorcycle,
I did.
of course.
Okay, anything else? Well, I appreciate everybody's attention. And if you think of any questions or want any more research, I know, like I said, Chris will be getting these links and everything.